The rain pecked at the ward windows as Maya clenched her mother's wristband and counted the beats between thunder. Ruth blinked at her and said, "You are kind, but my daughter is late." Maya said, "Mom, it's me." Fluorescence hummed like a warning. Nobody could translate. Ruth said, "Tell Maya to bring the blue box from the closet." A nurse hurried past, and the hallway clock clicked too loud to ignore. Maya said, "I brought it," but she held only a phone and a breaking heart. The drawer rasped open, yielding a scarred envelope with her name and a jagged V. Ruth said, "Do not let him take you again." And the words froze the room. Maya steadied her breath and felt the letter vibrate with the storm. The storm shoved Maya out to the curb where sirens braided with thunder. She called Jonah, and he answered on the first ring. Jonah said, "Tell me where you are." She named the hospital and swallowed the name like a pill. He said, "Stay put." A street light flickered, strobing the V on the envelope. Maya said, "She asked for a blue box, but I have no idea what it is." Jonah said, "Then we find it." Tires hissed through puddles like whispers that already knew her secret. She tucked the letter inside her coat and felt the weight shift her spine. The diner smelled like burnt coffee and second chances. Dr. Lila slid into the booth, and her eyes read the night off Maya's face. Maya said, "She looked at me like I was a visitor." Dr. Lila said, "She is lost, not gone." The envelope sat between them like contraband. Maya said, "There's a V and a box I should already know." Dr. Lila said, "Memory hides in objects. Find the box, and you might find a map." A jukebox sighed, and the storm retired to the gutters. Maya nodded, and the fear turned into focus. The storage unit coughed dust like a secret it had practiced. Jonah rolled the door, and cold air tasted of cardboard and old soap. Maya said, blue box," as if the words could summon it. A cracked crate waited under a quilt. Jonah said, "This one." Inside lay tapes, sea glass, and a photo of a pier where a man held a girl with careful hands. Maya said, "Who are you, V?" The back bore a date and a surname that curled like smoke. The truth felt close enough to fog her ribs. Dawn rinsed the ward with a softer light that did not flatter the truth. Ruth watched motes drift like snow she could almost name. Maya said, "I found the box." Ruth said, "Good girl, keep your name safe." Maya placed the photo on the blanket, and the man in it seemed to breathe. Ruth said, "He promised to leave us whole." Maya said, "Who is he?" Ruth said, "The man who signed papers that erased our house." The clock clicked, and the morning kept going, indifferent and bright. The apartment kept the storm in its lungs while Maya poured the blue box onto the table and listened to objects land like sentences. Maya said, "Start with what hurts least." Jonah said, "Oldest first." She spread tapes, keys, a deed, and a Polaroid under a crooked lamp that made ink bruise. Maya said, "Her signature shakes." Jonah said, "So does mine." The deed named a trust and a buyer who wore the letter V like Alma. Maya said, "Victor something," the copier ate the rest. Jonah said, "Property transfer 6 months after the fire." A key fob showed a stamped pier, same shape as the photo. Maya said, "He left breadcrumbs that only grief can read." She pressed the envelope to the table and felt the paper throb. Jonah said, "We pull the full record at county first thing." The lamp hummed and the storm slackened, and the room waited for a name that would not stay buried. Morning made the records office look harmless, which felt like a trick. Maya slid papers across a scratched counter to a clerk who yawned into his sleeve. Maya said, "I need the full transfer file and any guardianship notes." The clerk said, "Archive C12. Give me a minute." Jonah said, "We can wait forever." Fluorescence hummed like bees that had memorized the law. The file arrived dust-heavy and tied with tired string. The clerk said, "Buyer of record is Victor Hale, through a family trust." Maya said, show the signatory page. The clerk said, power of attorney on behalf of Ruth Ellis, granted after hospitalization. Jonah said, he moved while the smoke was still in the walls. Maya traced the V and felt heat where paper should be cold. Maya said, was there a contest? The clerk said, a hearing was scheduled, then withdrawn. Jonah said, someone blinked or someone bled. A copier thumped, and dust drifted like quiet verdicts. Dr. Lila kept her office warm for bad news, as if heat could soften names that had cut for years. Maya laid the file on the desk and waited for her hands to stop echoing. Eins. Maya said, he bought our house with a signature that pretended to be mercy. Dr. Lila said, he kept a roof when the court moved faster than grief. Maya said, why did no one tell me? Dr. Lila said, your mother asked for time that memory never granted. Maya said, it cut anyway. Dr. Lila closed her eyes and let silence settle like gauze. Dr. Lila said, he visited once and left a check he would not explain. Maya said, did you know him? Dr. Lila said, I knew the fear in your mother when his name arrived. Maya gathered the tapes and felt every label weigh a different hour. Dr. Lila said, if you listen, do it with someone who can catch you when it drops. They reached the pier before sunset, because answers prefer edges where water rewrites the sky. Gulls stitched question marks into the salt air. Maya said, he brought us here when I was small. Jonah said, maybe he watched from the bench with the chipped arm. The railing wore initials where storms had chewed the paint. Maya said, V, H, the same hand that drew the V on the envelope. Jonah said, he wanted you to find it, or to forgive what he hid. A fisherman looked once and folded back into the wind. Between slats the tide frothed like a nervous mouth. Maya pressed the Polaroid to the wood and found the knot that matched. Maya said, he was here. Jonah said, then he is not a ghost, only a man with reasons we will not like. The sun slid lower and turned the water the color of paperwork tea. Maya said, if he saved us and took us, which truth wins? Jonah said, the one you can carry without breaking. Back at the ward, machines spoke in patient syllables that tried not to scare anyone. Maya held a small cassette like a pulse that could learn manners. Ruth said, tell Maya I was brave. Maya said, I am here. She slid the tape into a borrowed player and let the click pick the hour. A man's voice cracked and shaped her name with someone else's hope. The voice said, I signed to keep the roof, then failed when fire found us first. Ruth turned her face to the window as if dawn could argue. Maya said, do I forgive this? The voice said, your mother asked me to disappear when the papers turned sharp. Static swarmed, and then gentled like rain that remembered how. Maya pressed stop and felt the gap throb louder than the words. Jonah said, we are not done until he speaks to you now. Not to a tape. Maya tucked the cassette back into the blue box and closed the lid like a promise. The courthouse hallway smelled of lemon polish and old anger. Maya clutched the cassette player while Jonah scanned the docket sheet. Maya said, guardianship hearing, March 15th, it never happened. Jonah said, it was withdrawn, maybe forced. A clerk with gray shoes slipped a folder across the counter without looking. Maya said, Ruth Ellis signed here but the pen lines don't match. Jonah said, forgery or fear. The folder bore a note in tight handwriting. He insisted we agree. Maya pressed her nails into the margin until it hurt. Jonah said Victor Hale wanted her house, maybe her silence. The hallway lights buzzed with the persistence of secrets. Maya said, he traded fire for property and used my mother's name as currency. Jonah said, then we put his name back into light. The folder snapped shut and echoed like a verdict whispered into the walls. The diner felt smaller when Victor Hale finally showed. His coat was expensive, but his eyes were frayed. Maya said, you bought our house after the fire. Victor said, I saved it from creditors who would have gutted it. Jonah said, you forged her name. Victor said, she signed under my counsel, asked the judge. Maya said, the tapes say different. Victor's hand trembled when he lifted the coffee, leaving rings that bled across Formica. Maya said, you erased us to protect yourself. Victor said, I erased myself long before your mother begged me. Jonah leaned forward and said, so you admit it. Victor said, I admit survival tastes like guilt that never leaves. The jukebox crackled but refused to play, and silence tasted like ash. Back at the ward, Ruth stirred as if she heard ghosts fight in the hallway. Maya laid the Polaroid on her lap. Ruth said, he promised the pier would always be ours. Maya said, he signed it away. Ruth said, he begged forgiveness once, and I could not give it. Jonah said, he profits on silence. Ruth clutched the photo until her knuckles paled. Maya said, did you love him? Ruth said, once in a world before smoke. Maya said, he betrayed you. Ruth said, and himself. The monitor beeped with steadier rhythm, as if truth restored air. Maya said, then I'll carry what you could not forgive. Ruth whispered, carry carefully, it cuts even when wrapped in memory. The rain returned, brushing the window like fingers that wanted in. Jonah's apartment smelled of wet wool and sharpened resolve. Maya spread the tapes across the floor like taro. Jonah said, play the next. The tape crackled, and Victor's voice said, I wanted to save the pier, but lawyers carve faster than grief. Maya said, he confesses on tape. Jonah said, confessions without court are whispers. Maya pressed pause and felt her pulse stutter. Maya said, how do I fight someone who trades truth for paperwork? Jonah said, by making the whispers loud enough. The radiator hissed like a warning they should not ignore. Maya said, he left us fire and death. Jonah said, then you leave him light he cannot swallow. The room tightened, the storm outside dragging clouds across brick like bruises. The pier at night held fewer shadows than the truth they carried. Maya said, he carved his initials here, but the sea still came for them. Jonah said, tides erase, but not memory. The waves slapped pylons with the rhythm of verdicts. Maya held the envelope open to the wind, the V staring back like a scar. Maya said, he wanted me to inherit fear. Jonah said, so inherit it and burn it clean. She struck a match and let the flame lick the edge of the paper until ash curled. Maya said, not forgotten, just freed. Jonah said, then he has no power left. The ashes spun out over black water like lost letters. Maya closed her eyes, and for a moment, the pier felt whole. The tide swallowed the rest. The office felt warmer than truth deserved, and the plants looked kinder than people. Maya set the file down and watched dust climb the light. Maya said, you knew why the hearing vanished. Dr. Lila said, I honored a promise I hate. Jonah said, whose promise? Dr. Lila opened a drawer and produced an envelope sealed in clinic tape. Dr. Lila said, your mother wrote this and asked me to wait. Maya said, wait for what? Dr. Lila said, for the day you were ready to hear the name you already carry. The desk clock clicked like a metronome for grief. Jonah said, is Victor that name? Dr. Lila said, he is more than a buyer. Maya felt the floor list under a tide she could not see. Dr. Lila said, read it where your hands can shake without shame. The chapel was empty, except for a red exit sign that refused subtlety. Maya sat beneath a wooden cross that creaked like an old ship. She broke the clinic tape with a breath that hurt. Ruth wrote of a winter when joy arrived without permission. Ruth said, he was careful, and he was wrong. Ruth said, I asked him to vanish when the debt came. Ruth said, he signed the deed to hide the house from wolves who wore badges and smiles. Ruth said, forgive me for folding your name into silence. Maya said, is he my father? The ink answered like a tide, returning a ring. Maya pressed the letter to her ribs and let the chapel hold the first crack of a new name. The waterfront cafe wore salt on its windows and regret on its menu. Victor arrived late and sat like a verdict that had learned manners. Maya said, "You are my father." Victor said, "I am the man who failed in public and loved in secret." Jonah said, "Secrets made this mess." Victor said, "Silence kept creditors from eating you." Maya said, "You took our home and called it shelter." Victor said, "I placed it in a trust you could claim when storms passed." Maya said, "The storm is me." Victor's hands shook, then stilled on a chipped saucer. Victor said, "I carved VH into the rail to leave a map I could not mail." Maya said, "You left me a wound that spells my name wrong." The gulls heckled through the glass. Ruth woke to the sound of a cart and the weight of a century. Victor stood in the doorway and forgot how to breathe. Maya said, "He is here." Ruth said, "Fire was my fault, and guilt made me brave in the wrong direction." Victor said, "I should have stayed and burned with you." Ruth said, "You would have burned our child with us." Maya said, "You chose silence over me." Ruth said, "I chose your safety over our names." The monitor beat steady like a drum taught by mercy. Victor said, "Let me pay the debt I borrowed from your future." Ruth reached for air and found his hand. Ruth said, "Pay it to her." The room loosened by an inch. Night found them in the apartment where the blue box had learned to speak. On a wall, Maya laid trust papers beside the tapes and the letter. Jonah said, "We can unwind the deed if intent was shield, not theft." Victor said, "The trust vests to you with a signature I owe." Maya said, "I want truth before title." Victor said, "Ask, and I will sign after." Maya said, "Were you proud of me from a distance?" Victor said, "Every day, and it did not help you once." The rain started again, polite now, like a choir. Maya said, "Tomorrow we file, and then we listen to the last tape." Jonah nodded, and the room agreed to hold both justice and blood. The county courthouse groaned with the shuffle of petitions and echoes of broken promises. Maya clutched the trust papers while Jonah steadied her with a glance. Maya said, "This is where silence ends." Victor stood behind them, posture bent by a lifetime of bargains. The clerk called their names and pushed forms across a scarred counter. Jonah said, "We file intent to contest guardianship and deed transfer." Victor said, "And I sign over the trust." Maya felt the pen balance between rage and relief. She said, "Truth belongs here even if it bleeds." Damp fell heavy, and the room felt lighter, though the shadows refused to leave. That night, Maya spread the last cassette on the table like a confession no one wanted. Jonah dimmed the lamp, as if shadows could soften sound. Maya pressed play, and her name bloomed in a broken whisper. Victor's voice said, "I watched from distance, proud but absent." Ruth's voice answered faintly, "Recorded from long ago, she will need both our halves, even if we are jagged." Maya pressed her palms flat to the wood, grounding herself. Jonah said, "This is more than evidence, it's memory preserved." Maya said, "It's proof of love warped by fire and shame." The tape clicked to silence, and she closed her eyes as if to hold it longer. The pier carried wind like a secret too loud to keep. Maya held the Polaroid against the rail where initials had faded into rust. Maya said, "This is the only place that remembers without lying." Jonah said, "Then let it witness." Victor approached, slower than tide, coat pulled tight. Victor said, "I carved these letters because I could not speak your name." Maya said, "You carved absence instead of presence." Victor said, "And you survived despite me." The gulls circled overhead like judges too restless to sit. Maya pressed the photo flat, then released it, letting the sea take what once was proof. She said, "The water can keep what we cannot." The words quiet hummed, like a lullaby that refused to end. Ruth stirred as Maya laid the signed trust papers by her bed. Maya said, "It is ours again." Ruth said, "You held what I dropped." Victor hovered at the doorway, unable to step closer. Ruth said, "Come here." Victor obeyed with steps carved from regret. Ruth said, "You are forgiven only if she allows." Maya said, Forgiveness is not gift, it is a bargain with scars. Jonah watched as Ruth clasped both their hands together. Ruth said, "Then let scars braid instead of bleed." The monitor steadied, a sound of fragile peace. Night wrapped the apartment in quiet resolve. Maya gathered the tapes, letters, and trust papers into the blue box. Jonah said, "You carry it lighter now." Maya said, "Because it no longer belongs only to me." Victor said, "Then let me leave it with you." Maya said, "Stay if you can stand the truth." He nodded and placed his hand on the lid. Maya said, "We begin with silence broken and end with silence chosen." Jonah said, "Tomorrow we return to the pier, not as ghosts but as witnesses." Rain tapped the glass gently, as if rehearsing applause. The blue box shut with a click that sounded like a door locking and unlocking at once. Dawn sharpened the courthouse steps while pigeons argued over yesterday's crumbs. Maya held the blue box like a compass that finally knew north. Jonah said, "You are ready because you are tired of being ready." Victor said, "I will not run when the name is spoken." Dr. Lila said, "Breathe into the ground and let it hold you." The tapes waited in a folder that smelled of rain and old plastic. Maya said, "We tell the whole of it or we tell nothing." Victor said, "I will say her name and yours without hiding." The sun cleared a cloud and put a fragile gold edge on every bruise. Maya said, "Whatever the judge decides, I will decide who I am." Jonah touched her shoulder and steadied the courage already standing. The doors swung open like a throat clearing before a hard truth. The courtroom ran on clocks and careful voices that feared heat. Judge Elena Park asked for the record and nodded to the clerk. Maya said, "I contest the deed and the guardianship filed during crisis." Jonah cued the tape, and the speakers crackled like a fire that remembered. Victor's voice said, "I signed to shield them and failed to return." The judge said, "Is this your voice and your intent?" Victor said, "It is my voice and my regret." Maya said, "I want truth restored, not a ruin built on blame." The gallery stilled, and even the air seemed to wait for courage. The judge called a recess, and the clock landed like a gavel twice. Victor rubbed the old scar on his wrist as if numbers were carved there. Maya gathered the tapes and felt their weight shift from shame to proof. The hallway smelled like paper and panic that had put on perfume. Dr. Lila said, "Recess is a bridge, not a refuge." Victor said, "Let me take the blame and end this." Maya's phone lit with the hospital number that always burned. The nurse said, "She is clear and asking for you before decisions are made." Maya said, "We go now and finish with her voice in the room." Jonah said, "We will bring the judge the same breath we bring her." Victor pressed his palm to the wall like a penitent at a gate. Dr. Lila said, "Carry the truth without letting it drag you." The elevator dinged, sounding almost kind. Maya tucked the blue box under her arm as if it were a child. The corridor stretched long and straight, promising no corners to hide in. The monitors hummed a tired lullaby while morning pressed a pale coin of light. Ruth said, "Do not trade your heart for a verdict that cannot love you." Maya said, "I want the house back and the name clean." Victor said, "I will confess on record and sign the trust to her alone." Ruth closed her eyes and said, "Then choose mercy that still keeps its teeth." Jonah said, "We tell the court what happened and ask for correction, not ruin." Maya held Ruth's hand and felt steadiness climb into her own pulse. Ruth said, "Bring me a key instead of a headline." Maya said, "You will have both and I will have myself." The lullaby steadied into a rhythm that sounded like room for breath. Victor wiped his eyes and faced the window as if learning how to turn. Dr. Lila nodded once, the small approval that anchors a crossing. They returned to the courtroom carrying hospital air like a second skin. Judge Elena Park said, "Proceed." Victor said, "I am the biological father, and I used a trust to shield assets." He said, "I signed during hospitalization, and I asked the record to correct me." Maya said, "I seek restoration of title and guardianship, and I decline damages. The judge studied both of them, as if measuring the distance between words and wounds. Jonah handed up the tapes, the letter, and the carved photo as exhibits. The judge said, "The court will order corrective relief and retain jurisdiction." Maya exhaled, and the weight shifted from survival to choice. Victor said, "Thank you for not breaking what I already bent." Maya said, "I will not be forgotten again by law or by love." The gavel fell, and the future opened like a door that finally fit its hinge. The house waited under a sky rinsed clean, its porch sagging like a held breath. Maya turned the new key and felt the tumblers accept history. "I will YD," Jonah said, "you brought it home." Victor stood at the walk and counted his apologies. Maya said, "We enter as witnesses, not ghosts." Dust rose and wrote soft hieroglyphs in the light. Dr. Lila said, "Name each room without flinching." Maya said kitchen, where she burned toast and called it brave. Jonah said, "Living room, where winter learned patience." Victor said, "Hallway, where I should have stayed." A floorboard popped as if adding testimony. Maya said, "This is not a shrine, it is a start." She opened a window, and the air remembered how to move. Outside, a gull shrieked like a judge relieved of duty. Inside, the walls held a polite ache, and the floors remembered every shoe. Maya set the blue box on the table and lifted the lid like a prayer. Maya said, "We return what belongs here." Jonah unrolled the quilt that survived more winters than sense. Jonah said, "This goes where morning can find it." Victor traced a dent in the doorframe and stopped at a pencil mark. Victor said, "She grew an inch the year the roof leaked." Dr. Lila said, "Place one thing, then let the room answer." Maya hung the pier photo without flinching. Maya said, "It means what we say, it means." The house exhaled, and the light deepened. Jonah found the old kettle and filled it like a promise. The first whistle blessed the ceiling with steam that sounded like mercy. The ward smelled of lemons and courage rehearsed. Maya placed a key on Ruth's blanket and steadied the tremor in her breath. Maya said, "The rooms remember, and so will we." Ruth said, "You brought me a door." Jonah said, "And a kettle that sings like old mornings." Ruth smiled, the smile she saved for stories that end. Victor stood in the corner like a statue learning to bend. Victor said, "I will repair and repay until the house forgives me." Ruth said, "Houses forgive when people do." Maya held her hand and let silence do work no sentence could. Dr. Lila said, "Take the pace of healing, not the pace of victory." The monitor agreed with a rhythm that sounded almost like a lullaby. Ruth closed her eyes and rested inside the quiet she earned. Evening gathered at the pier like a congregation that preferred wind. Maya leaned on the rail where initials had faded into patience. Maya said, "I am Ellis by choice and Hale by truth." Victor said, "Both can stand if you let them." Jonah said, "Names are tools, not cages." The tide lifted and fell like a slow heartbeat learning trust. "I'm bewamed." Maya said, "You will meet me as father, not savior." Victor said, "I will meet you as the man I am now." A gull skimmed the surface and shook diamonds from its wings. Maya said, "We build what smoke could not." Jonah laughed, small and bright, and it rang clear. The horizon kept its quiet vow and did not look away. The moment held without shattering. At dawn the house wore a modest halo, and the street forgot to hurry. Maya walked room to room and let memory choose where to sit. Maya said, "I will keep what keeps me." She wrote her name inside the closet frame where water never reaches. Jonah brewed coffee that smelled like a treaty between days. Jonah said, "Home is just choices with a roof." Victor left tools on the porch and a note that promised work, not absolution. Dr. Lila said, "Call when the quiet turns sharp." Maya opened every window and let salt air pass the threshold. She said, fading into the forgotten stops here. The light gathered on the blue box, and it did not need to speak. The house held still, and then it held her.